Today's session is about common problems that we've run into when working with addresses, and we're very excited to dive in and uncover some secrets and solutions that we've found when working with address data. However, before I move on to our presenter, let's go over just a couple pieces of housekeeping items. One, this webinar will be recorded. We'll send a copy of this out to everyone who registered. So if you do have to step out a little early, you'll get a copy of this to your inbox. You can be looking forward to that in the next several hours, probably, maybe tomorrow. We'll get it out to you as quick as we can. Also, that video will be shareable. You don't have to log in or anything to view the recording, so you can send that to whoever you think would benefit from the content. All right, to interact with our presenter and to make sure that you're getting the most out of this session, please do use the chat and the Q&A sections of the Zoom webinar interface. This allows us to make sure that we're answering your questions and that you are getting what you expected to out of this session. So don't hesitate to chat in there, and we'll get to as many of your questions and comments as we can. All right, so to present for us today, we have Adam Charlton. We're very excited to hear what he's got to say, what you've got to say, Adam. And without further ado, Adam Charlton.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Andrew. Like you said, I'm Adam Charlton. I'm a developer on the core products team working with our address validation tools such as US Street API, Autocomplete Pro, and our master address list products here at Smarty. I've spent quite a lot of time dealing with address data across our various products. And not only do I have a lot of firsthand experience working with the type of address data that we have across our products here at Smarty, but I have a lot of experience with interacting with some of our customers and trying to see what their use cases, what are some of the problems that they run into, and how we can best address some of those problems. So I've taken some of that experience and tried to condense it into some of the most common types of problems that we have that we run into here at Smarty and that we've been hearing from our customers about working with address data. Like Andrew mentioned before, if you have any questions, if you want any clarification on anything that I said, or if you have specific use cases or specific problems that you'd like to see addressed, feel free to chat it in. I believe Andrew is going to be fielding a lot of these questions and the chat. But yeah, so Andrew, if anything comes up that you want me to address that I haven't quite addressed, feel free to bring it up. All right, so here is some of the, if I can actually get it to switch screens here. So here's some of the core problems that we're going to be dealing with, which is preventing bad data on input. We're going to be talking about data blending, which tends to be our biggest use case. And how we're going to deal with that is a lot of standardization, but standardization itself comes with a lot of really tricky pitfalls that you need to be careful of, because if you standardize incorrectly, you can end up digging yourself into a bigger hole than where you started. We'll talk more about that later. Improperly interpreting the results from your address validation engine. There are some tricky situations that unless you're being real careful about how you're validating addresses, you can end up with results that don't quite make sense, or maybe results that you're not quite expecting. You're not using them the way that you thought that you were. And then finally, we're going to talk about staying up to date, how to make sure that your addresses are continuously valid, making sure that, if you have addresses from a long time ago, that they're still around, making sure that the street name hasn't changed, that there's no metadata changes, that you always have the most up-to-date information available. So the very first thing, though, that we have to talk about is preventing bad data as it's incoming. There's sort of this mantra with data, and that's garbage in, garbage out. You hear it across all sorts of different fields. I used to do work with survey collection as well. And there's always that mantra, garbage in, garbage out. Machine learning also has this. But if you have bad data flowing into your database system, into your data analytics process, then you're not going to be able to get anything useful out of it. And with address data, that's very much the case. Now, you can get bad address data from a number of different sources. No matter where you get your address data from, there's always the risk that you might get a little bit of weird or odd or bad data. Users can mistype their address into whatever address submission form that they have. Maybe you bought data from a source that didn't properly verify all of their addresses, or worse, they didn't verify the addresses in the same way that you are, in that you're expecting addresses that might not be valid for your use case. And worst of all, if you improperly handle your data when it's in your system, you could potentially lose all of the necessary and useful information in such a way that you can't necessarily retrieve it. You can avoid these, though, by making sure that you validate your addresses on input into your system. All of the problems later on can, or large chunks of them, can be avoided as you make sure that your data is valid coming into the system. Because sometimes when it is in your system, if there is bad data within your system, if you accidentally lose the entire city, state, and zip code, sometimes there's nothing that you can do in order to retrieve that information. So, for example, there is a lot of users that maybe only kept the street name, the primary number, the street name, and then the city. And they lose through one means or another the state or the zip code. Maybe they didn't think it was important to save. Maybe it was a local company and they didn't think to save that information because they're only working within their local region. But when they go and try and validate that, when they try and sell that data, suddenly the company, they can't properly validate that address because it could refer to anywhere in the country. So for example, if the city is Washington, there's like 90 different cities in the US that are named Washington. And so if you just have 123 Main Street in the Washington city, you sometimes can't tell. So the best thing that you can do is just make sure that you validate addresses, validate information that's flowing into your system. If it doesn't validate, yeah, you can throw it away. Or maybe, save it in a different spot so that you don't lose the data entirely, but you don't mix it in with your valid, proper address data. Springfield is another very common city name. But the more that you prevent bad data from getting into your system, the less problems that you'll have later down the line, as we'll see. So like I mentioned before, data blending tends to be the most common use case for our customers. You take data sources from a couple of different places. Maybe you bought the data, maybe you're collecting these, you're grabbing address information from local and regional governments, and you need to merge them all together in order to make a cohesive data set. It's a very common application, but there are some mistakes that can lead to very serious problems. When you're merging them in, if you do it improperly, you can end up with duplicate data. If you have the same record in both these regions, maybe you have a county address information, you have a local city. The local city is going to be far more precise than probably the county-wide information, but you're going to have duplicate records in both. And so when you merge them in, you want to make sure that if there's records that match up, you want to throw them away. But you also want to make sure that you don't have records that improperly match up when you're doing your merge, because then you're throwing away perfectly valid records that otherwise you could have made a good use of. But one of the most interesting and often the most insidious type of merging errors tends to be when you incorrectly combine address data together from different sources. So if you have metadata, geocodes and demographic information and your addresses, and you try and merge them up improperly, then you could end up with wildly different metadata fields that really, really hamper your ability to make any sort of useful analysis out of it.
So this kind of brings up a question, and I think we're going to get into it down the line a little bit, but this might be a good time. If we're going to be standardizing and we're not going to be using a tool, if we're going to standardize by hand, what is better? Is it better to use fully spelled out words like all of Florida rather than FL, or all of the word street versus ST? What is the standard, and is it generally better to follow the USPS's standardization or make up your own? Like, what's your thoughts there?
Yeah, we're going to touch on self-standardization a little bit. one of the problems that, especially in preparation for this, is that standardization as a practice is actually very difficult, because USPS, or not just USPS, but US address data can be a little bit tricky. There are some general guidelines that you can follow to make that process easier for you. For example, if something can be abbreviated, always abbreviate it. You don't want street spelled out on one side and it abbreviated to ST on the other side. But you can still run into very serious problems. So for example, street or ST might not only mean street. It can also be Saint, as in like St. Louis, it's just ST Louis. And so when you're standardizing, you have to be very, very careful as you work through your address. Some of the specific guidelines are never use alternate cities, and we'll go back to that. Always use the default city. Always abbreviate down as far as you can. Always fully capitalize or just lowercase everything. Remove all special characters like dashes, hyphens, ampersands, things like that. And so if you follow those rules, you'll get as close as you can without having to write your own parsing engine to interpret the address. Self-standardization is a rather tricky topic, but thank you for bringing that up. A lot of the information presented today is going to have to deal with using a validation or a standardization engine, just because it can be very tricky. Yeah, you see, and I mention it right here. Self-standardization, it's difficult. If you're really set on doing it yourself, USPS does have some really good guidelines. When we're talking about US addresses, USPS and the USPS guidelines really are the place to start. It's the industry standard. They have the majority of all addresses in the US under their system. And so even for the addresses that aren't under the USPS system, it still makes sense to standardize them and to follow USPS guidelines when dealing with those addresses. But thank you for bringing that up, Andrew. So yes, like we were talking about, standardization solves a lot of the issues that we deal with data blending. Now, in order to properly blend the data, though, when you have multiple sources, you either need to have an external ID to correlate the two sources together. By the way, USPS delivery point barcode is not sufficient for this task. The delivery point barcode doesn't handle certain types of postal addresses like R7s, non-postals, obviously you can't correlate data sources with, and other types of addresses that share barcodes. That's a very common mistake, but it can be potentially really troubling if you try and correlate data sources based solely off the DPP barcode. And if you don't decide to go with an external ID, you have to have identically formatted address fields. So exactly like we were talking about before, even down to the smallest minutia of making sure it's capitalized, making sure it's abbreviated the same. Finally, standardization does not mean validation. Just because you format an address to look a particular way, it does not mean that that address actually exists. So you need to separate out those ideas that validation, just because an address is standardized, it looks nice and clean and is formatted like an address, does not make it a real address. So be aware when you're merging data. Yeah, so in addition to all of the standardization tips, if you're going to do self-standardization, if you're using a standardization engine, here's also some tips to standardize properly. Alternate city names. There are a lot of situations in the US where there are alternate cities that could be valid. A good example is something like a very small city on the outskirts of Chicago, or something like Queens, New York, right? If you put in Queens, it might be understood. People might look at that on the letter and understand where it needs to go, even though it might not be the actual proper city name. These are called alternate cities. So if you have two different data sources, one uses, Queens and one uses New York, they might both validate properly. But if you're using alternate city names, they will look like distinct addresses. Now, this means that they'll show up as duplicate addresses within your data set. And there could be all sorts of problems that arise from that. People can even use alternate city names to, for example, sign up for multiple accounts using multiple different addresses, even though it's still all one address in possible cases of fraud, right? So what you got to do is often use the default city name. The default city name, each zip code, one city is registered as the default, tends to be the best way to avoid mistakes. Another is to componentize as much as possible. If you throw everything into one line, you could run into problems. So for example, like I mentioned before, street and saint are abbreviated the same way. And if you just throw everything into one address line, you could run into problems when you're going back to and analyze it later. It's like, is this word referring to like a street name? Is it referring to a city? For example, there is the city of Key West in Virginia, or the city of Key in the state, West Virginia. You run into weird problems like that you really got to be careful of. So as much as possible, componentize, and at a minimum, do first line. So your street address, city, state, and zip. And this is, you really have to use the same standardization for all of your data sources when you're blending it. If even if both of your data sources are standardized independently, if they use slightly different standardization methods when you go to merge them in, even though everything's standardized, they're not standardized with each other. And so you'll still end up with lots of merging problems. Great. So the next major problem that we're going to deal with is staying up to date. There's a lot of addresses that flow through database systems that are just out of date, and out of date data is sometimes worse than the data not even being there at all, because it's a false positive, right? It's data that exists and you think it's highly accurate, but is actually, you're making decisions and business decisions based on faulty information. And so you really have to have a process, whether it's just a business practice to make sure that your data stays up to date as possible, but also like in technology, you have to have a technology pathway to make sure that there's a process to continuously refresh your data. The USPS releases new data every single month. This is metadata, updates, and also new addresses that flow into the system, new developments being built, non-postal addresses that are now supported by USPS. The USPS also removes addresses. This happens far less often. Typically, the USPS at the beginning of the year cleans up all of their addresses that got bulldozed or torn down over the last year. That tends to happen at the beginning of the year. So if you have your address database and you've just been slowly adding to it over the last decade or so, building up your client base or whatever, you might want to consider going through and revalidating all those addresses, because some of them might have been demolished. Some of them might have had a street name change, which we'll get to that in a minute. But it's really, really helpful to continuously update your address list, just so you are making your decisions based on the most up-to-date information available. So addresses change in a number of different ways. You can have the actual address name change. Street names change all the time, especially lately. There's a lot of street name changes that are changing from one to another for one reason or another. City boundaries often change. There's an entire county in Texas that there's a bunch of addresses right on the border, and it completely shifted from one city over to another, whole neighborhoods. And with that, not only did the city change, but the zip code and all of the street names and all of the street numbers all changed. The USPS and a lot of validation services are really good at linking address A to B. So if you put in address A, and there's a change, it'll return it and go, hey, this address changed. It's often called lax link change. And goes, this address changed. We validated your address, but here's the new name of it. But metadata changes are also very, very common. RDI, so like your type of property, residential or commercial, your congressional district, and demographic information changes often on a monthly basis. So you really need to make sure that if you're making decision based on any of these metadata fields, continuously validate them to make sure that you're making these decisions based on correct information. And then we mentioned this before, addresses can be removed from data sets. So you need to make sure that for whatever your use case is, that you're checking to make sure that it's still valid. This doesn't necessarily mean USPS invalid. USPS can sometimes, it doesn't happen very often, but it can happen sometimes that the USPS picks out an area and decides to not service that area anymore. It's too far out of the route. Maybe a town is slowly becoming a ghost town, and so they decide it's not worth it to keep servicing that area, and so they stop service there. It doesn't necessarily mean that the building's not there anymore, that people don't live there, just that the USPS aren't servicing that area. However, more often than not, it's that buildings get bulldozed for whatever reason to make skyscrapers or parking lots or whatever. Buildings get demolished, rebuilt, and so addresses can flow in and out of the system frequently. Typically happens at the beginning of the year, like I mentioned before. So you've gone through the whole process. You're making sure that you're validating information coming into your system. You're making sure that when it's in your system, you're properly validating it, you're cycling through and updating that information that's in your system. Now you need to know how to properly validate that information system, because some of the core problems that you can run into is when it looks like you have a valid address, but in reality, it's not necessarily the type of address that you're looking for. And we'll go into this will depend heavily on the type of validation service that you're using. Obviously, in some of the examples, we're going to be doing this a bit Smarty specific with some of Smarty's validation tools, but these topics are generally applicable to any validation service that you're using. You just need to make sure that you look into some of these topics like that we're going to cover, like unique zip codes and non-postals. So with Smarty, we call this match codes. So when you call an address, when you validate it, you get back what's called match footnotes. These are critical pieces of information that can often be overlooked when you're not familiar with the types of information that it contains. And finally, ensure that your validation actually matches what your use case is. Non-postals often fall into this category. If you're a mass mailing customer and you're looking to have a good set of everyone in the country that you can mail a letter to, well, non-postals aren't really going to fit into that category. However, for a real estate developer, those are totally applicable addresses that you want to be able to know about. Empty lots, again, for a real estate developer, empty lots are awesome. You can buy the property, you can build a building there, but there's not necessarily anyone there that you can go visit or that you can deliver a package to. So you really have to make sure that your validation usage matches your use case. In fact, there was a previous webinar on this subject. It was the address masterclass. Andrew, if you wouldn't mind sending a link to that webinar, the address masterclass in chat. This is a webinar that really goes into validation types and usages, and whether or not it fits your use case. And so go give that a shot if you still have questions about this. I've picked out 3 particular validation problems that I'm going to cover. We're going to go over unique zip codes, semi-valid addresses, and non-postals. But with unique zip codes, this is an area where a lot of people who are checking to make sure if addresses are real or not run into issues. This is an interesting situation. There's some places in the US that receive such a high volume of mail that the USPS has given them their own zip code. The Empire State Building is one of them. A lot of different university campuses in America and large corporate office buildings all have their own unique zip codes. The USPS enters into an agreement with these companies that if they put in their specific zip code, they give it to the company, and then the company handles all of their mail internally. So the Empire State Building has this huge mail room in the basement where they get just buckets and buckets of mail from the USPS, and they deliver it by themselves internally inside the Empire State Building through like pneumatic tubes. It's really cool. But it means, though, that when you use a validation service, like anything that uses USPS as a validation service, which is pretty much everyone, you're not going to get a whole lot of information about what addresses are real within the Empire State Building, because from your validation service, everything is valid. It is mailable. You're just not able to get specific validation information on particular people or apartments within the Empire State Building, which makes it a little bit harder. Again, the Address Masterclass webinar has a lot of information about this subject. In fact, this is such a big critical component of understanding address validation that within Smarty, we actually have 3 different codes in 3 different places to really tell you, like, hey, this is unique zip code. The DPV footnotes and our footnotes and the zip type all try and tell you this is a unique zip code. Be careful. Your address validated, you can mail to it, but it might not actually exist. So next thing we're going to talk about is what I call semi-valid addresses. This is a problem that I get asked about quite frequently and comes up quite frequently in our support channels here at Smarty. There's particular types of addresses that, so for example, if you have a big, high-rise building, 123 Main Street, it's a giant skyscraper building, and you enter in apartment 1026. The building's right. You got the building correct, but there is no apartment 1026. This is what we call an invalid secondary address. We return here at Smarty the code AACC. Other validation services may use their own codes, but these types of addresses look valid at first unless you're specifically looking at the footnotes. And so you need to go through and validate all of the addresses in your system to make sure that it's not flooded by these types of semi-valid addresses. It looks real because we return a lot of the information for the root address. That is the best match that we are able to find, is that parent address, that base address for the building. But the secondary that you put in isn't valid. These footnotes and footnotes in the other validation services all help to address this type of problem and try and tell you, like, hey, we are only able to partially match your address. R7 addresses also fit into this. R7s are semi-postal addresses. They're mailable, like you can write the address on a letter and send it to them, but they're not street deliverable. Typically, all the residents in an R7 area go and pick up their mail at the post office instead of in mailbox in front of their house. They don't have the full DPP barcode, which is one of the reasons why you can't use it to correlate information when doing data blending. These types of addresses look kind of suspicious at first when you first run the validation. They don't have all of the information available to them. Some of the footnotes and, for example, the DPV barcode are shortened. It doesn't look like a full address. These are real places. The USPS knows about them. They just don't have the full delivery service available, so it removes a lot of the information. Addresses like this, you really have to become a little bit more aware of what's going on in order to properly validate them for your system. So the final thing we're going to talk about, and we've talked about it a lot before, are non-postals. So with non-postals, not every address is USPS servable. Some addresses are way out in the middle of the country, where the USPS, it's just a bit of a hassle for them to make a mail delivery route way out there. Some addresses are brand new developments, they were just barely built. People have just barely moved into them. And so USPS hasn't constructed a route to hit those addresses yet. There's real addresses out there with people living in these buildings that aren't necessarily mailable. We keep talking about USPS validation because it's such a driving force in the address industry. Depending on your use case, these addresses might be valid. We mentioned this before, like mass mailing and real estate developers. You typically need a special validation service in order to hit non-postal addresses. So for example, here at Smarty, we have our Smarty Enhanced Match, which can match to non-postal addresses. And so if you have a database of addresses and you're processing through them, unless you're using these special non-postal validation services, you might be throwing away perfectly good addresses that are non-postals, they're valid in every way except being able to mail a letter there. And these types of, and I see this quite a lot, actually. A part of what we do is make sure that people are trying to help ensure that people are getting the best match rates possible. And people are often throwing a bunch of non-postal records through non-postal lookup methodology. So not using Smarty Enhanced Match. And they're throwing away a lot of really, really valid data that they otherwise could be getting use out of. And so in things like this, you need to make sure that when you're working with non-postals, if there's even the suspicion that you have non-postal data in your data set, you need to use the proper validation methodology, like here at Smarty, the Smarty Enhanced Match. So that's all the core common problems that I had to deal with. If you want to try out our address validation engine, including our enhanced matching for non-postals, we have a SmartUp link here. Andrew, was there any final comments or questions from anyone that I need to address?
You know it. There's some additional questions about PO boxes and some of the other services that Smarty or maybe other vendors may offer. PO boxes may change over time. How does any tips or tricks on how to change PO box information? I'm not 100% sure what this one could be. If you would mind giving me a little bit more information, but I'm imagining if someone moves, do PO boxes offer forwarding addresses?
Yeah, unfortunately, PO boxes are one of the tricky aspect for address validation. Like Andrew said, yeah, if someone switches PO boxes, if a company decides to switch from PO Box 7 to PO Box 11, there's really no way of being able to continuously provide information on where a PO box delivers mail to. So there's only so much we can do. So if a post office has a bunch of PO boxes and a customer switches from one to another, there's no way of tracking that, because even though, if Smarty has PO Box 4 and moves to PO Box 11, well, PO Box 4 is still valid. It just doesn't belong to Smarty anymore. Sure. And so that there's really not a good way of being able to trace PO box information, unfortunately. Sorry. Okay.
Here's another great question. So Smarty validates addresses, including, additional numbers, secondary units and things like that. But it will also validate PO boxes. But does Smarty, or do you know where we can go to try to validate a name, like a customer name or a company, on an address or a PO box? Is that something that we do, or what are your thoughts on that?
And this is very similar to what we talked about before. There's not a good way at the moment to validate particular PO box numbers to company information.
Excellent. Even there are some services out there I know of that claim to be able to do that. They'll match it with other data that they've got, but even those don't tend to be 100% accurate.
They tend to go out of date very quickly as well. A lot of services like that tend to get their information by web scraping. They'll scour the internet and in like particular companies' websites in order to look for mailing information, for PO box information, and that type of data can go out of date and become stale quite quickly.
Excellent. Here's a great question. Would the enhanced match service for non-postal addresses include cell towers?
That is a really interesting question. And the answer is if the cell tower has a street address. And so if there's a cell tower, right, like on the top of a mountain, there's probably not a street address associated with that cell tower. Our enhanced match can match to cell towers as long as they have a street address. And so for most cell towers do fit that bill. However, cell towers out in the middle of nowhere where they put them intentionally far away from people, you're driving on no-named dirt roads out to get to them. Enhanced match is not able to match to those types of cell towers. However, for the majority of cell towers, yeah, we can.
Fantastic. Those are all the questions that we can take today. Thanks everybody for visiting and listening to Adam speak and share his wisdom and genius with us. We appreciate your time, Adam. Don't forget to go and check out smarty.com/signup if you don't already have an account, and you can get a ton of stuff for free. If you get a free account, there's loads of opportunities to get free lookups in all of our tools inside that account. So again, that's smarty.com/signup. Thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you guys next time.